Well, I was thinking about awkward social moments. Not that I see myself as overly socially awkward, but you know those moments when, particularly now after COVID, where you can go to parties and weddings and those kind of occasions again, and you're caught in those moments where people are perfectly friendly towards you, but you just stood there with a glass and you realise that everybody else is talking and you're stood on your own.
Yes.
And there are moments that are relatable from that in our wider political world.
There are. And when you chuck into that mix the desire of politicians to be seen positively by people who will see those images at home, sometimes things can get very, very awkward indeed. Now, this week has been a big political week, no question. Today was a big day in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, because there's this huge get-together of Western leaders in Brussels at NATO. So let's have a look. The Prime Minister was there, President Biden was there, President Macron was there, all of these very influential Western leaders. Lots of pictures of Boris Johnson pressing the flesh, shaking hands with Macron, having a chat with Biden, all those kinds of things. But then one snapshot of the footage, who, shock horror, has been picked up by Boris Johnson's critics, shows actually him being a bit like you,
awkward.
Chris,
yeah,
that
exactly.
person standing on their own.
I know, exactly. Stood there kind of hoping that somebody else might come up and talk to you, and then you look over your shoulder and there's a group of people who are already in a kind of quartet, and it'd be a bit awkward to muscle your way into it. So you just hang around. And of course, crucially, those kind of moments, they know they're being filmed. To an extent, it is for the benefit of the cameras, and so they are gamed to an extent by all of the leaders to project a certain image.
They do, and that's why you see some political leaders just marching up and actually literally like barging their way in to look as if they're the one in control, they're the one in the centre of things. And I cannot say how many times I've seen politicians do it to each other, or even who's going to be last to go in, who can put the hand on the back and like, oh, I'm really in charge of what's happening here. But the most frenzied one I have ever seen was at the G7 in Cornwall. Summit nerds on Newscast might even remember this.
This was Carbis Bay, wasn't it?
Carbis Bay,
yeah.
Gorgeous Cornwall. The Queen was there. She had her photograph taken surrounded by these world leaders.
Oh, it was outside, wasn't it?
It was outside at Eden Project. Beautiful. Not only did she quit, I'm not going to impersonate the Queen. That would be a terrible thing to do. Aren't we meant to look like we're enjoying ourselves? But after the photograph, oh my God, they were like bees around a honeypot. Every single one of those leaders were practically barging each other out of the way to have their snap taken.
The ultimate global stateswoman.
The ultimate global stateswoman, absolutely. It was quite something. So when you see those pictures of the summit in tomorrow's newspapers or online, Boris Johnson did shake hands with a lot of people, but there also was that bit of an awkward moment when he was channeling you, Chris Mason.
Exactly.
The awkward wedding guest.
There you go. Exactly. So that was the choreography, and if you like, the bit that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, and plenty to get into from that, and indeed from this week with the spring statement. Huge domestic week here, news-wise, on this edition of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
So hello, it is Chris in the Newscast studio.
And Laura in the same studio. Hello.
And Adam, as you'll know if you've been listening on BBC Sounds during the week, still trying to shake off COVID, and so holed up in Fleming Towers.
Well, actually, let's start as we mean to go on. I can bring you breaking news.
Oh, yes.
Adam has just sent us a picture of his negative COVID test.
Ah, hurrah.
Hurrah from the sickbed. There we go. Well, he'll be back next week.
In the building tomorrow doing Friday's newscast, and then back here next week doing the telly version as well as the podcast version. So, Laura, we should talk about, obviously, the context remains colossal with what's happening internationally in Ukraine and Russia. But then this week, that real sense of the domestic focus and what it means here in terms of bills and the cost of living, and you throw in what's happening internationally to what was already a very difficult picture politically as far as the public finances are concerned. And then another big moment for Rishi Sunak, this guy who's spent a couple of years whenever he can saying that his instincts are to be very careful and fiscally conservative and wanting to cut taxes, and yet these huge pressures for another big intervention when people are massively feeling the squeeze, and if they're not yet, soon will be.
That's right. I mean, he's this sort of PERMACRISIS chancellor, if you like, who's only known one economic emergency after the other. And as you say, we've known for some time, haven't we, that inflation was on the way up. We've known there's going to be huge pressure for people, particularly from energy bills. That was already going to be the case, that money was going less far before the invasion of Ukraine. That, of course, has exacerbated and accelerated that. So the backdrop to the Chancellor's spring statement, which is not as big a deal as a budget, but it's still a big moment. It's kind of getting tougher by the day. But what was fascinating about the set of political choices that Rishi Sunak made, because they are a set of political choices, was that any wriggle room he had, he held some of it back for when things get worse, which people expect them to. But some of it also we put towards tax cuts and the promise of a tax cut in 2 years' time. Not a real tax cut, but the promise of a tax cut in 2 years' time. Really trying to polish up his own kind of status in the Conservative Party. Because genuinely, I think he believes it, that he wants to cut taxes. But also he wants other people to see him that way. The problem for him trying to create this image of himself as a tax cutter is one of the tax cuts is a promise of something in 2 years' time that he can't guarantee. Because he doesn't even know what energy bills are going to be in 6 months, and he might not even be Chancellor. And second of all, the other tax cut that he talked about, taking more people out of having to pay national insurance, is a partial reversal of a tax rise that he himself introduced. And overall, he's a Chancellor who's raised taxes very, very significantly. So the opposition and his critics and some people in the Tory party would say, actually, he's doing a bit of the hokey-cokey here, a few smoke and mirrors around.
It's so interesting. So the other day, I was channeling my inner Adam Fleming. And because someone's got to do it when he's not here, when he still had the 2 red bars of doom. And reading, because I'd missed it at the time, because it was right at the start, I think it was on the day, in fact, that Russia had invaded Ukraine, of the Chancellor's Mays lecture at a business school in London.
Yes, not a field of corn.
No. Which was the kind of essence of Rishi Sunak as his economic philosophy, really. And it was all talking about Adam Smith, the guy who was seen as the sort of father of free markets and all that kind of stuff, and his big central desire in the end to have a smaller state, that the government can't solve all of our problems. Classic kind of conservative Chancellor kind of thinking. And yet, as you say, here he is, because of the circumstances of a pandemic and now what he's facing now, coupled with his own political choices, with a bigger tax burden and a bigger spending state than has happened in our lifetimes, in the lifetimes of lots of newscasters, leaving him in a situation where the only way he can kind of burnish that political sense of wanting to be seen to be a tax cutter is to promise something that might never happen in a couple of years, coupled with a tax cut that is actually chipping off a bit of what you were saying was a tax rise.
And there are, some measures in there that are going to help people. 5p off fuel duty, less than the amount that we all know petrol's gone up by, but 5p off fuel duty, bit of extra money to help people who struggle most with their energy bills. But there's a real sense, even among ministers, and I have to say some ministers I talked to today have been really scathing actually about, not necessarily about the individual measures, but the impression that Rishi Sunak's given. It's a kind of wait and see until things get really, really bad before he actually is going to give people any more help. But that sort of disconnect, one minister was saying to me, actually, right now the public wants the state to help them. Politics is not in a place where the population is in the mood for that kind of lean, low tax, agile. We're just not in that kind of moment. And one minister was saying to me, the reason why the Tories are so successful is because they kind of read the room, right? They read what the country wants in that particular moment.
Boris Johnson was willing to embrace big spending.
Right. And their claim was that Rishi Sunak actually has demonstrated in the last 24 hours, and it's one view, and his team would deny it, that actually maybe he's less able to read what the public wants than he would like to believe. And so quite sharp criticism and fascinating. Let's just give people a reminder. Look at the front pages this morning. Even the Conservative supporting bits of the press, really scathing about that kind of tin air. But I know you've been chatting to MPs and ministers today as well.
I went over the road into Parliament, and firstly, someone made exactly that point of the disjuncture between the broad reception, positive reception that the Chancellor seemed to get when he met his backbenchers immediately afterwards,
and then in the Commons,
and all the waving the paper and all that, and then the front pages. And then I was talking to a minister who doesn't normally shoot their mouth off, who said it was tinkering. There was little bits here and there that people will barely notice because either the petrol station doesn't pass on the tax cut or the price of oil goes up by more than that and it just gets overtaken by events. Someone also, and they did not mean this as a compliment because they're on the Conservative side, compared it to some of Gordon Brown's budgets of let's tinker here and let's move there, and stealthy little things that don't really don't really add up to much. And then, and this is a more sort of micro-political point, people taking their mickey out of him. And this is quite interesting in terms of the brand Rishi and his, future ambitions, the whole business of that car he filled up with petrol that wasn't his, that was the sort of photo op connected to the 5p cut in duty. And that sense that perhaps, as this Conservative put it, not quite grasping the scale of the challenge. That this would be a massive, as the government acknowledges, this would be a massive challenge for any government at any time. But given the taxing and spending of the last few years, are they sufficiently inclined, as some see it, to want to do it again, or try to get into a more traditional Conservative space?
Yeah, and look, inflation is a nightmare for any government, right? It is a nightmare, and there is a limit to what they can do about it. And, Rishi Sunak's team, I think, would say they need the other bits of the government, but also the public actually to understand that there are limits to what any government can do.
And we're seeing that,
about the economy, and we're seeing that. And we're seeing that in other countries, and we're seeing that from what he's saying. But, is it worth betting 50p that in the next few months he's going to be back at the dispatch box, plus the big spenders, 50p? Okay, let's make it a whole pound. Is it worth a small bet that he'll be back at the dispatch box having to announce more support, whether that's for energy bills or whether it's, doing something else on benefits? Because there's no mention of increases to benefits yesterday. No mention also, and there's not been much talk about this, and we'll get into some of this with our guests in a moment, I think. What does this also mean for other government budgets? Because the government's cash will go less far too.
Yes.
When it comes to inflation. So if you are, if you're the Department of Transport trying to build all the roads that Boris Johnson has promised.
Yeah, and
what, are we going to have 5% fewer roads? Are we going to have some fewer new hospitals being built? Because everything's going to cost more, and it's going to cost more for the government as well as all of us. Last thought, I actually think that perhaps any of the detail of yesterday is just going to be kind of completely swamped actually by the sort of roar of inflation coming in at the rate it might do.
And then the tricky thing then is that if you're in the Treasury, you think, you've funded a tax cut, and it costs you money, but doesn't really get you anywhere.
Might not get you anything
politically.
And you've given away what might have been your big election giveaway. So you've already promised that income tax cut in the election. So what are you going to promise me now? Voters don't go, oh, thank you so much for what you've already promised me. It's what's next, what's next,
Completely.
what's next. And of course, don't forget, Rishi Sunak has got a next door neighbour who's quite fond of getting him to write big cheques for big projects, big grand ideas.
And there's a philosophical difference there it would appear.
It's a Rishi Sunak budget. And there are going to be people in the Tory party who might be quietly have a little bit of, what's it called? What's the Schadenfreude?
Yes.
Might be quite happy that, that the sort of Rishi Sunak image
it's just taking a little bit
of a knock.
Yeah.
Maybe even some people in number 10.
Might be quite happy to see
because it was a Rishi Sunak budget, right?
Yes,
It wasn't a Boris Johnson budget. And we are we're in a relationship, probably a more sort of traditional number 10, number 11 relationship, where number 11 doesn't share everything it doesn't have to with number 10. That old idea that Dominic Cummings had, that there would be this great, joint team, and the nerve
led to
centre of
Sajid
government.
Javid packing it in as Chancellor and Rishi Sunak coming in.
Exactly, we are not in that world. There is a number 10 worldview, there is a number 11 worldview, and they do not always join up. So,
and they're very different characters in so many different ways. And then, and to an extent, kind of, what matters to so many people now is the bills they're facing.
Of course.
And politics is secondary to that, and a general election is a million miles down the track, potentially. But the extent to which this coming crunch around the cost of living could have massive political implications for how this government is perceived and how electorally viable it is at the next election is huge, isn't it? If people start thinking, particularly if people start blaming, which they may or may not, but start blaming the government for the predicament so many people could find themselves in pretty soon.
And it's hard to have a feel-good factor for any government when people are feeling skint. Now, I don't want you to take offence. I don't want to make you feel bad. Talk about feel-good factor, but I'm going to chuck you out.
It's that moment. It's
Off to your cupboard of news.
After my, glorious week of solitude, when both you and Adam were away, I'm going to return for the first time.
Now he says.
Well, you've got to seize these moments.
Thank you very much. Right, off you go.
I'll go and vacate the seat for the big brains of economics. They're going to join us.
Marvellous. All right, I'll chat to you in a second.
All right, cheers. I'm taking my water, though, I tell you.
So now Chris is in the cupboard and has made space for our guest tonight. Rupert Harrison, who now works for BlackRock, the giant investment company, but was chief of staff to George Osborne, so you know your way around a budget. And Dr. Miatta Fahnbulleh, who's the chief exec of the New Economics Foundation. And you advised 3 prime ministers on economics, didn't you?
I did.
Blimey. Well, so to both of you, first of all, just most straightforwardly, what did you make of yesterday overall when you saw all the announcements?
I think for me, the word of the day was disappointing. I think when you're being told by the OBR that we're seeing the biggest living standards squeeze since the 1950s, when you know you've got a massive cost of living crisis, I just don't think he did enough, particularly, and this is the bit that I'm hoping Rupert can shed some light because I still don't get, particularly for the bottom households, the people that we know are on the edge, the people that we know are literally at the point where it's catastrophic because they've cut everything they can cut, they've done everything they can do, and there was nothing, literally nothing in the budget. In fact, what we had was an 11 billion real terms cut in social security, which seems absolutely extraordinary after the cut to the £20 uplift. So for me, that was the thing, that I don't feel like that budget recognised the scale of the challenge out there and what people are feeling and how painful it is. And therefore, it felt really tone deaf.
And the Office for Budget Responsibilities, the OBR, so like the official number crunchers who did give that warning that we're looking at the sharpest drop in living standards, basically, since records began, or modern records began. But, I mean, Rupert, for you, can you see what he was trying to do? Because a lot of people have had that reaction, including some Conservatives and the Conservative traditionally supporting newspapers.
I think I can see what he's trying to do. I think basically it's a sort of wait-and-see strategy. And in a way that makes sense because, unfortunately, this is going to get worse. We know it's going to get worse. We know that particularly household gas and energy prices are going to go up again. And I'm pretty confident this is not the last word from Rishi Sunak on how he's going to deal with the cost of living crisis. In fact, the Prime Minister's already said today, we will do more. Yeah. So I think that Rishi Sunak's whole strategy was basically to kind of live to fight another day. He needed to do one big thing, which was secure his national insurance rise. And actually, that's, in a sense, from a narrow Treasury point of view, quite an achievement. So he felt that was very important in order to deliver sustainable public finances, pay for the extra money for the NHS and social care. And a lot of people thought he was going to have to backtrack on that in the face of this massive cost of living crisis. He's got that enormous tax rise through. He's done enough, I think, for the Conservative Party to say we're helping, where the bottom end of the income distribution on tax. He's done that energy package a few weeks ago for the first bit of the increase. And look, he's going to have to do more. I think he knows that. But it was living to fight another day, I think.
Well, I'm glad you said he's going to have to do more because I've already bet Chris 50p that he'll be back before that long with some more measures to help. But Chris...
Yeah, Miatta, I wonder what... I'm looking forward to that 50p if I win the bet. Every Yorkshireman will crave every 50p they can get. Miatta, I wonder, given your analysis and your sense that not enough was done, what one thing do you think he should or could have done that he didn't do?
So the single thing that I think he could have done and should have done was on universal credit. For me, if he had, for example, put in £9 billion in order to uprate universal credit with inflation, that would have been made it a big difference. I would have liked him to do £15 billion, which essentially would reverse the cuts that we've seen since 2010. And for a two-person household with 2 kids, that's about £4,000 in their pocket, which for families that are literally on the brink at the moment, having to miss meals, not feeding their kids because they can't survive anymore, that would have been a huge lifeline. I don't know why he didn't do that.
Do you have sympathy, though, for Rishi Sunak in this situation? So the debt interest, £83 billion now. And for the government, as well as for everybody, cash is going less far.
Well, so I think we're overstating the debt interest. So if you look at what the Office for Budget Responsibility has said, it spikes this year. Yes, it does. And it's a big number. But then if you look at it as a percentage of GDP, every single year in the Parliament, it's below 2%. And if you compare that to the 30-year average, which is about 2.2%, we're actually at a relatively low place. So he has space. And then if you look at what's happening to debt, it's decreasing at the fastest rate over the next 5 years than it has done for decades. So I don't buy this argument that he didn't have space and he doesn't have space. He does have space, not to even talk about the fact that the Bank of England has bought up 40% of the debt. So again, it feels like a political construct because he doesn't want to act. And that's the thing I don't understand. against the biggest cost of living crisis we've seen in decades.
I mean, we've got to remember the big picture is the government is still borrowing, many billions of pounds, and the public finances are still reeling from the impact of the pandemic, where the Treasury, I think, very quickly and very effectively stepped in with huge sums to support the economy with the furlough scheme. So it's clearly not the case that this Treasury and this Chancellor aren't willing to step in. But I think he's very conscious that he's just had the pandemic, still borrowing a huge amount, and the national debt is a lot higher than it was. And he is very focused on the fact that he needs to try and get that under control. Look, of course, I think we all wish there was more money available to help with the cost of living. We know that particularly these energy price and food price increases are going to cause real hardship. And sadly, it's only going to get worse over the course of the year. But no government can totally insulate all of us from these global energy prices. It's something that unfortunately is making all of us poorer. They can do what they can, but there isn't this sort of endless pot of money to say, okay, here's energy prices going up, we're basically going to just take the entire hit to the taxpayer. It sadly isn't realistic.
No, but no one's saying that. But I think the two things I'd say is, I don't think we're out of the crisis yet. I think the cost of living crisis is a fallout from the pandemic. So actually that crisis war mode that we were in the pandemic, I think has to continue. And that's what a lot of other European countries are doing. And we do have headspace. In the end, what's his fiscal space he has to play with? He's still got room to manoeuvre, because what matters is the cost of financing that debt. And that is, when you compare it over the last 30 years, still at a sustainable, realistic number. The second thing is, why on earth is he not putting a windfall tax on energy producers and energy generators in order to ask them to take some of the hit so he can cushion price rises for consumers? That's a choice he's made, which makes absolutely no sense when they're making supernormal profits. So forget about even out with debt. There's stuff that he could have done if he chose to do it.
I mean, look, again, all these things are very difficult. It's interesting, the German coalition government actually announced today a package of very similar size, so helping households with about €300 on their energy bills. They actually announced a very kind of eye-popping 30 cents on the euro cut in fuel duty. So it looks a lot bigger, but it's only for 3 months. So actually, when you add it all up, it's quite similar in size. Windfall taxes are, again, very tempting. But, the whole response to this energy crisis and Ukraine is that we need energy security so that we're not buying oil and gas from Russia. We need more renewables investment. If you slap a windfall tax just at the moment when you're asking the corporate sector to step up with massive investment, you're going to achieve exactly the reverse. So, none of these things are costless options, sadly. Just
to sort of dispute that. So I absolutely agree with you that in the end, windfall tax is a short-term measure, but it will cushion us for 2 years. And by the way, whilst it's doing that, we should be investing in renewables. We should be doing insulation.
But the reason, over the last 10 years, the UK had the biggest renewables rollout last 12 years, biggest renewables rollout of any developed economy. And that was because we had a really certain framework. You could come in, get your investment, you knew what the payback was going to be. If you start messing with that certainty, you're not going to be able to repeat the trick.
But in a world where actually even the market will say the sorts of profits that we're seeing in the energy market with producers and generators are supernormal profits. They weren't banking on it. It wasn't in their investment pipeline. It wasn't in their program for giving dividends. These are supernormal profits, which actually, when you look at the scale of it, a lot of people could justify why you would do that, given the absolute pain that consumers are feeling. So I think you can still have that environment. And what actually matters is, the signals the government sends about long-term investment in renewables. We back this, the things that you do to give the market certainty. I think you can do that and ask actually some of the generators to take some of the hit in order to cushion consumers.
Rupert, we've had loads of newscasters getting in touch with us in all sorts of sectors, citizens' advice, education, health, talking about their fears around how people are going to deal with the cost of living crisis, as it's increasingly called. And I just wonder if politics has maybe shifted as a result of the pandemic. Maybe there's a greater expectation out there, whatever the pressures on the spreadsheets of the Treasury, that people have grown accustomed to bigger government now and perhaps want more of it. And certainly looking at some of the front pages, some of the mutterings that Laura and I have been having privately with various ministers, that fear that he hasn't grasped the scale of the challenge, Rishi Sunak.
No, I think that's a really good point. I think people that saw the scale of the intervention in the pandemic and expect something of similar size, and maybe that helps to explain why the sort of the reaction today has been a little bit underwhelmed.
But do you think Rishi Sunak, who's a very polished politician, spends a lot of time and effort on his image, did he get the presentation of it wrong, even if you think the policies are in the right place?
Look, it's always very difficult when you're a chancellor. You've got multiple audiences. You've got to get the benches behind you cheering on the day. You've got the newspapers the next morning. And, of course, most importantly, you've got the voters and the real impact on people. Look, clearly it hasn't landed as he would have wanted. I think normally honesty is the best policy, and just say, look, this is a very difficult situation. I can't do everything. There will be more. The thing about there will be more is I know the Treasury are always very, very nervous about raising expectations, because you think, they put kind of £10 on the table and then number 10 will be there to take 20.
Well, hang on a minute, he's promising to cut income tax in 2 years' time.
Well, that's true. I mean, that is, I think also trying to kind of put his marker down in a way to say, look, this is the election campaign I want to be fighting in 2 years' time. And he's saying to Boris Johnson, in a sense, like, any money that I have to spare is going on this, not on, the next thing you come to ask me for.
That's interesting. So it's a message to the next door neighbour as much as anybody
Partly,
else.
yeah.
Interesting. Miatta, what do you think listening to that?
So I think he got this wrong, which is a bit odd because he is very good on image, and I think he has up to now played the politics really well. I think he's a popular chancellor because he's read where the public is and he's managed to kind of position himself. I thought the income tax in 2 years was bonkers. It was bonkers because actually he doesn't know what position he's going to be in the public finances. So it's a huge
or
hostage.
Or he'll be Chancellor.
Well, exactly. It's a huge hostage to fortune. That means that if things go wrong, what are you going to do? U-turn before general election? So I think that was odd. But more importantly, I think for a lot of people, you're like, why on earth are you talking about an income tax drop in 2 years' time when I've got a cost of living crisis now? So I don't think he got that right. And, I think if he had said to people, let's wait and see, I think maybe there would have been some sympathy. But I think for a lot of people, they're like, what are you waiting to see for? Like, it is biting now, it's pinching now. And actually, don't be the chancellor that, my one criticism of him is he's always looking back and reacting. And actually, he could have been a bit proactive and said, I know this is coming. This is only going to go in one direction,
but
right?
hang on a bit. I know, your economic views are in a certain place perfectly legitimately, but there might have been lots of people who think, actually, do you know what? I've been paying loads of tax. I'm quite happy about the idea of a tax cut. That does give me some hope that when times are tough, actually, I'm going to get a bit more of my money back. And he's taking some money off when I go to fill up at the pump. So, that will be appealing to many people listening to it.
I mean, there is a bit of a contrast as well between actually some of the polling evidence the last 24 hours that people like the measures and these very bad front pages, clearly, that he got. And in a sense, it's because he's sort of not in the kind of Westminster world, he's not really pleasing anyone because he's having to put up taxes. So the right-wing papers don't like that. And he's not really doing what the left-wing papers wanted on benefits and helping with the cost of living. So he's kind of caught between the two. But actually, I agree that, people will say, well, at least he's cut fuel duty, at least he's trying to cut tax. We know that those things will at least go down well.
And to be fair to him, the national insurance threshold, which I think was the measure, the biggest measure in there that actually bites, for middle-income households, that's like £400. So that is a genuine thing. I don't think anyone's taking that away from him. I think my issue with it is for a low-income household that it's £60. For the richest 10%, it's £500. So if you're thinking about how you use your money, I think he could have used it in a better way in order to protect the people that are really hurting. And, when you help 70%, but the 30% you don't help aren't the richest, which is what you'd expect, but it's the 30% that are the poorest, that stinks for me. That stinks. I just don't understand it.
Well, thank you both so much. We got through a big chat about the Spring Statement, which is not a budget, but like a budget, but with Rupert Harrison in the studio without even mentioning a sausage roll or a pasty. Oh, there we go. I had to do it just at the end. I couldn't help myself.
Almost 10 years to the day.
Is it really? Oh, my God, we're all so old.
Sorry about
that. Oh, dear. Miatta and Rupert, thank you so much for coming in and joining us on Newscast tonight. Thank you.
And thank you for watching and listening, and we'll be back soon. Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.